Hi everyone! We have created the config server in the previous lectures. And now we can change the first microservice, Twitter to Kafka service, to use this config server. Let's add Spring Cloud Starter config dependency to Twitter to Kafka service. By adding this dependency, we say that this microservice will use the Spring Cloud config server. We then need to add a Bootstrap YAML file to set up Spring Cloud properties. Again, we need to use Bootstrap configuration here, as the fetching of configuration from config server should be before loading the application configuration. In the Bootstrap YAML file, we first specify the Spring application name, which is a name for our microservice, and then we set the active profile Twitter_to_Kafka. And finally, we specify the Spring Cloud config name as Twitter to Kafka service, config client. This config client here is important because we use this prefix in the configuration files of config server repository. So if you look at the config server repository, you will see a file config client Twitter to Kafka. That means we want to get the data from that configuration file for Twitter to Kafka service, which has the name as a combination of Spring Cloud config name and profiles active. So the naming is important here. The configuration file of a specific microservice should have the correct naming with the specified profiles active property. And for URI, we specify the config server URL, which is currently running on localhost 8888. Now if we run the config server, and after that Twitter to Kafka service, we can check in logs that the configuration is really fetched remotely from config server. Note that prior to running Twitter to Kafka service, we also run Kafka cluster, because Twitter to Kafka service requires a Kafka cluster running locally. Let's now check the logs. As we see here, configuration is fetched from config server. One more thing here is that when we run maven clean install command, it will now require a config server if you run tests. So please run config server before running maven install command for Twitter to Kafka service, which will be required because maven install command will load the context from Twitter to Kafka service, since we defined a context load test there. So it will require a config server, as it will try to fetch data from config server. Or again, we may use maven install skip test command to skip the context load test. In that case, you will not need a config server running locally before running maven install command for Twitter to Kafka service. Alright, I will see you in the next section.